Welcome to this week's episode of On Record PR, where we dig into the strategies and insights that matter most to law firm leaders. I'm Jennifer Simpson Carr, and in today's episode, we're exploring how technology and AI are rewriting the litigation ecosystem. Joining me today is Nishat Mehta, the CEO of Lexitas, which is a leading provider of technology-enabled litigation services. Before stepping into that role, Nishat spent years building data and analytics products at scale, and he brings a very cool combination of technical depth and operational experience to the conversation today. So, Nishat, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be here.
I was very impressed by your mathematics and engineering. Did I get that right? Engineering degree from Harvard?
Computer science. Yeah.
Computer science. Okay. Which I wasn't sure whether or not to include in the opening, but I think for our listeners, it's always exciting to hear when people are really experts in the field that they're talking about. So I hope you don't mind me throwing that in.
No, not at all. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm not sure either of those are things that I use in my day job.
Okay.
But I think there is a way of thinking that, in particular, computer scientists, so you take a complex problem, you break it down into smaller, less complex pieces, you perfect each of those pieces, and you put them all back together. And I think that has applications to how you run a company, how you build a product, how you plan my marriage, right? There's so many
Sure.
things in life that are exactly that, where the large problem is so complex, but the ability to figure out finite and concrete and sort of mutually exclusive components that can each be perfected. I feel like that's a lot of what we're doing here at Lexitas and looking at the entire process from end to end around how we deliver some of the services that we do.
That's great. So it does sound like you use it every day, and I'm glad that I did bring it up.
I appreciate that.
So before we dive into the big strategic questions, let's just kind of level set for our listeners. For those who may not be familiar with Lexitas, what does the company do? And what does technology-enabled litigation services mean in practice?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So at a high level, our goal is to provide the full suite of litigation services that many of our clients look to outside companies to provide. So today we focus on 4 services: 1, court reporting; 2, medical records retrieval; 3, service of process; and then 4, legal talent. We think all 4 of these areas are areas that are extremely useful to litigators, and again, things that are better done at scale, and as a result, things that oftentimes law firms don't want to bring in-house. The tech enablement part is of particular interest to me because, frankly, I think every industry is going through some sort of a tech enablement over the last 20, 30 years. And the easier ones to tech enable have been done, things like retail moving to e-commerce and things along those lines. But I would argue the legal industry in particular is a challenging one because this is an industry, rightfully so, that does not want to take on any additional risk than is already in play given the industry that we're in. And as a result, introducing new ways of doing things, introducing potentially automated ways of doing things that don't involve human interaction, introduces risk. And as a result, we need to make sure the technology is ready to go and works before we can gain the trust of any of our clients to adopt it. And so for me, it's been a big focus of mine is we refer to it internally as intentional innovation. That it's not just innovation for the sake of innovation or taking the newest things that can be done and introducing them to our client base, but rather figuring out how we best do that in a way that doesn't introduce any additional risk, that is as easy to use as people are used to already working with the things that we offer. And so maybe one quick example of that is deposition summaries. This is a capability that is now common in the space today, that in addition to the few 100-page deposition transcript, it would be nice if we could use AI to summarize it. And for us, our first version of that product was a PDF document. So use the same interface that lawyers are already comfortable with and deliver a 5 extra page PDF on the front end of the deposition transcript that gives you a summary of the deposition. And then we have a whole host of tools to make sure that the AI isn't hallucinating. So for instance, we ask multiple AI models the same questions, we generate multiple summaries, and then we compare the summaries to each other to make sure that they don't differ. And if they do, then we go back and ask follow-up questions. And that's how we get sort of double and triple checks to make sure that the summary is actually correct.
So all of that is very interesting, and it's opened up a series of questions that maybe I wasn't really prepared to ask, but I think would be interesting to dive into. So the first being, you've spent your career in different industries that are at various points in the adoption of different technologies. Where do you see legal kind of on that curve of adoption?
Yeah, so the easy answer, I would argue the dinner conversation answer is, oh, legal is, slow to adopt technology. I take a very different approach. I think legal is focused on responsibly adopting technology, and by definition, that makes them on the latter part of the adoption curve. And the primary reason for that is because the risk associated with getting something wrong in this industry is far greater than using AI to design the label of the can of soup that you're putting on a shelf, right? There's a lot more risk associated with this industry, and therefore we need to be more restricted about the adoption of the technology. So, admittedly, this industry is towards the later end of adoption. But I would argue the biggest reason why the technology now is exciting is because the notion of generative AI works on text. Prior to this, most of technology focused on numbers, but this is an industry that is entirely built around text. And so now that you have technology that can be applied to it, this is the right technology for this industry to take full advantage of. And I think it's why you're seeing the explosion of legal tech companies at this moment in time versus, call it, the last generation or two generations ago of sort of of tech innovation.
So I really appreciate the lens that you brought to that answer, because as someone who's worked in legal most of my career, the the dinner conversation is, oh, they're so slow to adopt. They're 10 years behind other industries. But when you think about the risk, as you mentioned, associated, there are only a few professions I can think of quickly where the risk also involves potentially losing the ability to practice what it is, that you do as your livelihood. So I just want to say that I appreciate that lens, and that there is additional factors that the legal industry, the healthcare industry, certain other industries do need to consider, beyond just that they are risk averse generally.
I think
So
that's a great point. And to your point, the medical industry would carry a similar risk and is also oftentimes lumped in with the legal industry as being late adopters of technology. I think you're absolutely right there.
So let's talk a little bit with, I think, a healthy dose of skepticism, because the legal industry, and I think the world generally, has been promised this tech revolution. And you mentioned a 20-year timeline, which is kind of a similar timeline that I had in my mind. So we've heard LegalZoom, e-discovery, contract analysis, and every time these waves of tech have come up, there's headlines and there's buzz around it. And then the technology fits into a pretty narrow role.
Mhm.
Now it feels a little different. So, what signals are you seeing in the work that you do every day that might suggest this point in time is actually an inflection point and not just another mini tech cycle, if you will?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there are a couple of things that immediately come to mind. So I think the first is the pressure on our clients, sorry, the pressure on companies to adopt artificial intelligence, I think is creating the pressure for them to place on all of their vendors, including the law firms that they work with. And so I think for maybe the first time since COVID, and then not clear kind of prior to that, clients are the ones forcing law firms to move in this direction. And as a result, you find a situation where law firms have all the right incentives in order to deliver great work for their clients to actually adopt technology. So that to me is the first thing, that it's becoming important for all parties, the client and the law firm, to do so. And as a result, let's take the time to figure this thing out. I think the second would be the indication I made earlier, which is this form of technology is technology that acts on text as opposed to numbers, and as a result is far more relevant to this industry than previous waves of technology have been. And then I would argue the third is that we're beginning to see actual success happen. And in particular, probably the larger law firms are beginning to dedicate teams of folks focused on AI, and those folks are beginning to find areas of value within the firm. And as a result, it's becoming a bit of a catch-up game for all of the other firms in the industry that in order to keep up with what's happening with some of the larger firms, they've got to figure out obviously less effective, less expensive ways of being able to apply the similar technologies. And so I think for the first time in some time, law firms are actually not being pulled kicking and screaming to adopt the technology, but are actively wanting to adopt the technology for the reasons I just mentioned.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications, a public relations and marketing agency serving law firms and businesses worldwide. With an expert team positioned throughout the U.S. and supported by an international faculty, Furia Rubel enhances our clients' brands through integrated communications by providing expert guidance in crisis management and high-profile litigation, protecting brand and reputation, and supporting internal marketing teams. To learn more, visit furiarubel.com.
So you come to this conversation with a product and data lens. When you look across litigation services through that lens, where do you see the biggest gaps and the places where a product mindset could really uncover the value that the legal industry hasn't really seen yet?
Yeah, I, I am. I will say one thing that makes me nervous about the impact of AI on our industry is I imagine over the next handful of years we will see an explosion of pro se filings. I think ChatGPT and others are making it a lot easier for me to file cases, write the appropriate documents. And frankly, the sort of sycophantic nature of these various large language models make it such that they're going to tell me, oh, of course you have a case. This is an amazing case. You should absolutely file. And so I worry that the ease with which you can begin to file cases, the ability for non-lawyers to represent themselves is going to result in a massive explosion of cases being filed. And where, on the one hand, there is some benefit to that, lowering the cost of access to justice is certainly a goal of this entire industry. There is a very real possibility that it goes too far and you have a bunch of junk that gets filed. And as a result, for me, a big response to that needs to be the ability to understand and process these cases more quickly. And whether that means understanding that a case is needs is sort of a useless case is one side of the coin. Another side of the coin is understanding when there is value to a case, but appreciating how much value there is to make the determination on whether you actually move forward with the case, whether you think about settlements, etc. And so to me, that's where I think a product mindset can really start to apply, is where this starts, the pace and the scale starts to exceed the ability for attorneys to spend as much time evaluating a case as they used to. You start to need some help, and that help can't be in the form of paralegals. You'll have a shortage there as well. You need to start thinking about how technology can actually help take on some of the evaluation or triage of the cases that come your way.
So you've touched on cost, which is a big topic of conversation around technology and AI. And considering that the billable hour has been the backbone of how the legal industry bills, and obviously that comes at odds with efficiency. If AI compresses the time it takes to review a transcript, draft a motion, do all of the things that we talked about, how do you see that tension playing out?
I think there's a few ways to look at that question. So the first to me is I am very bullish on the legal industry generally. I think going back to the comment I made earlier, I think case filings will go significantly higher over the next handful of years. Whether represented by attorneys or not remains to be seen, but I think both sides will increase. I also believe that the supply of attorneys goes up. I don't necessarily mean that the number of attorneys goes up, but I think the efficiencies that we're talking about with AI will allow the same individual to handle far more cases than they previously have been able to. And so to me, I think we have an industry where both demand and supply are actually going to increase, and I think that will be beneficial to the industry. The notion of the billable hour is a separate issue, and to me, first of all, let's be clear here. This is an industry that, as we just discussed, moves at the sort of late adopter pace, and as a result, I don't expect the billable hour to go away next year. I think all these sort of discussions about this quick shift to outcome-based pricing, while that might be the long-term outcome, I don't think it's a next year, next 3, next 5 years. I think it might be a 10 to 50-year transition for the for the industry, much like the billable hour has been alive for roughly 100 years or so, or even longer. So I'm not worried that it goes away quickly, but what I do think we move towards is AI that potentially represents my outside counsel. And in some sense, that can be a sandbox of all the documents that my outside counsel would normally have reviewed, a short memo with the summary, but then a chatbot that allows me to ask questions that come to mind to get additional questions answered that don't require me actually asking my outside counsel. And to me, is that outcome-based pricing? Is that a per query pricing that ultimately goes, back to the billable hour? But now I'm not asking my attorney, I'm asking an AI. I think there's a lot of sort of ways that we can think about what that pricing model looks like. But ultimately, I feel like that's likely to be the outcome that we get to, in much the same way that a McKinsey outcome is a bunch of billable hours, presentation at the end of an 8-week engagement, and then a 150-slide deck that has a whole bunch of appendices with additional information that I might analyze. I feel like that's where we're headed with the legal industry, where that 150-slide deck is the LLM that I have access to.
That's really interesting. And I'm just going through my head of types of practices I could see that applying to, and others that might not be able to adopt that model. We could go down a rabbit hole, but
Sure.
That's really interesting. So I guess along the same lines, if we're looking ahead, what would success look like in your mind for the industry? And if you just answered it, if that was how you've described it as success, then we can move on. But what would firms need to do? What would firms need to change in order to be the firms that succeeded 3 to 5 years from now?
Yeah, so it is some part of what we've talked about, but I think it always helps when we're thinking about that question to start from kind of first principles. So first principles is access to justice, right? So at the end of the day, what success looks like and has always looked like for this industry is greater and greater access to justice on all parties, plaintiff and defense. So then you start to figure out what is it about this time that increases access to justice for everybody. And I think that's where we start to see things like the ability to triage cases more easily, the ability to file cases more easily, the ability to leverage AI to make attorneys more and more focused on the hard questions and leave the easy questions to some form of technology, so that we can focus the specialists on the things that they need to be specialists on and let the generalist capabilities be handled by technology. And I think that's really where we should be leaning in. And then ultimately support that with a commercial model that works for everybody, that works for plaintiffs, that works for defense, doesn't bankrupt the system, doesn't lead to bad behaviors, et cetera. But that to me is sort of the end, the end goal, a vision of what we want to accomplish, a set of technology that enables that to be accomplished, and a commercial model that supports all of that.
So final question before we end our time together. And it's more a personal one about observations. When you came to the legal industry from the industries in which you've worked previously, what surprised you the most?
I would argue that the focus of this industry on doing what's right for their client, I think, is the part that folks outside the industry don't always see. I think there is a perception from outside the industry that the billable hour model creates an incentive for lawyers to run up a bill. And that is not what I've seen. What I have truly seen is an eagerness to figure out how you get through this case, do what's right for your client, and move on to the next one. And it might be that we're self-selecting the attorneys that we work with and the clients that we work with that do that. But it's been a very pleasant surprise, because again, I think it is oftentimes the case that the legal industry is the sort of the butt of jokes, and that's that's unfortunate, because that's not at all what I've seen, and it's been a pleasant surprise to understand that that is in fact not the case with this industry.
So, Nishat, I can safely say that people outside of the legal industry would not want to have dinner with me and you together, because I think we have the same perspective on the legal industry and how these incredible professionals show up to represent their clients. So thank you for that.
Agree.
So I really appreciate the conversation. There's so much that I'm going to walk away with. I'm sure our listeners will as well. And I want to thank you. I want to thank our listeners for joining us today. If you have questions, ideas for topics, or future guests, please continue to email those thoughts to us at podcast@onrecordpr.com. And Nishat, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
On Record PR is produced by Jennifer Simpson Carr and Matt Henderson, with support from the team at Furia Ruble Communications. This episode is edited by Isabel Horan and Christian Yamula. Visit www.onrecordpr.com for resources and more information.